Here's what I mean. Quote, do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling his job as president? Disapprove by a margin of 12 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the federal workforce? Disapprove by a margin of 13 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling foreign policy? Disapprove by a margin of 14 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the economy? Disapprove by a margin of 15 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Trump is handling trade? Disapprove by a margin of 16 points. All right, well, how about this one? How about his signature issue, a thing that he actually did run on when he campaigned for president, a thing he really most wants to be associated with, the policy that he most wants you to identify with him and his name. Do you think, American public, do you think it is a good thing, his signature issue? Here's the way the question was phrased. Thinking about the short term, do you think President Trump's tariffs will help or hurt the U.S. economy? The proportion of Americans who say Trump's tariffs gonna help, 22%. The proportion of Americans who say Trump's tariffs will hurt us is 72%. So by a 50-point margin, Americans believe that Donald Trump is deliberately hurting us with his big signature policy idea of these genius tariffs. By a 50-point margin, Americans say what he's doing is hurtful to us deliberately. Which brings us to what I mentioned at the top, our spelunking expedition together this evening, our exploration of caves. The incident of Donald Trump caving today that's getting the most attention, understandably so, is his panicked cave, his panicked U-turn on tariffs. For all his famed and supposed attention to the stock market, I got to tell you, Donald Trump has been very happy to preside over huge off-the-cliff plunges in the stock market repeatedly. In fact, in history, if you look at the Dow Jones, if you look at the 10 largest single-day point drops in the Dow in history, of the 10 worst point drops ever on the Dow, Donald Trump was the president for 9 of those 10 days. Some were in his first term, some were this past week with the tariffs debacle. Yeah. He was president for 9 of the 10 worst one-day point drops on the Dow. And you might say there's, the takeaway message there is, wow, why would any Wall Street person, any business person, anyone with a single share of stock, anyone with a retirement account, why would any of those folks ever support this particular person for president? Reasonable question. But the other takeaway here is about him and not just how good or not he is for stocks. The other takeaway here, I think it's fair to say, is that he doesn't much care about tanking the stock market all the time. It's like a day that ends in Y for him. He's famous for doing it. What happened today that was different? After all his remaining tariff threats went into effect at midnight last night, what happened today was not that the stock market tanked. It did at the beginning of the day with the tariffs in place, but that's, again, normal for a day with Donald Trump at the wheel. What was different today was not that the stock market tanked again, right? It was that the bond market tanked at the beginning of the day. And you don't have to know that much about the markets to know that when things go crazy economically, and even sometimes when things just go crazy in other ways, people rush to put their money somewhere safe. And for decades, for the entire span of America's global economic dominance, the safe place that people have run to when stuff is crazy has been U.S. bonds, American Treasury bonds, because when the world is going nuts, for whatever reason, you can at least count on the full faith and credit of the government of the United States of America, right? So usually, bad economic times mean that people want to buy lots of T-bills, lots of Treasury bonds. That's the safe harbor. But we're in a new environment now, because it turns out something different happens when the reason things are crazy is that the U.S. government itself is crazy. It's that the U.S. president has grabbed the wheel, and he doesn't drink, so we know he's not drunk, but boy, he sure is driving like he's drunk. I mean, when the problem is the actions of the U.S. government, instead of fleeing to the U.S. government for safety, now people flee away from the U.S. government to find safety. And so unlike every other economic crisis in modern history, people in this economic crisis, induced by Donald Trump, people today, at the beginning of the day, started selling their T-bills, started selling their U.S. treasuries. A lot. And that is not just an inversion of typical economic behavior. That indicates an inversion of America's role in the world as the dominant economy. Also, in practical terms, a sell-off like that in the U.S. bond market, I mean, that portends a way bigger economic disaster for the United States than Trump tanking the stock market over the past week. Right? The bond market falling apart is a much bigger deal than the stock market falling apart in terms of the fundamentals of who we are in the world and how our money and our economy works. Because the stability of the U.S. bond market is what we depend on essentially for the spine of our economy. Everything from mortgage rates in the housing market to the integrity of our multi-trillion-dollar national debt. So yes, the stock market stuff under Trump has been scary, but if the bond market blows up, say goodbye to the U.S. economy. And today, what happened is the bond market started blowing up. When that happened at the opening of the bond markets today, that's apparently what turned things around. That's how we discovered this lovely cave that Donald Trump led us into today on his tariff policy. NBC News reports tonight that Trump caved. Trump reversed course on his tariff gambit today because of, quote, deep concern bordering on panic from his top economic officials regarding the bond markets. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, not always allies in the various tariff debates at the White House, nevertheless presented a united front today to the president, urging a pause on what he was doing on tariffs, a pause, quote, over concerns about the bond markets. My colleague Chris Hayes, I think, nutted up what happened here very well today. He posted this on Blue Sky. Quote, you set the house on fire, watched it burn, and then lost your nerve and put it out. You now have a partially burned house. Great job. Exactly. But don't lose sight of some of the other lovely caves on our spelunking tour today. For example, this one, headline, Associated Press, Trump administration says it cut funding to some life-saving UN food programs by mistake. Quote, the State Department says it has rolled back an undisclosed number of sweeping funding cuts to UN World Food Program emergency projects in 14 countries, saying it had terminated some of the contracts for life-saving aid, quote, by mistake. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce told reporters, quote, there were a few programs that were cut in other countries that were not meant to be cut. Bruce said she had no immediate information on which countries had U.S. funding restored. She gave no explanation for how some contracts came to be canceled in error. Oops. Yeah, we have no idea. So I guess we'll put them back. We don't even know how we're making these mistakes. We know it's a mistake, but we don't even know what the mistake is. But rest assured, we know what we're doing, and if you criticize us, watch out. But, you know, just as Chris noted, as he said, you know, even after panicking and putting out the house fire you started, you still have a partially burned house. There's still damage done, even as they try to reverse all of these mistakes they're making. You still have a partially burned house, just as Chris noted there. The New York Times is reporting tonight that even some of the critical programs that the Trump administration said they didn't mean to cut apparently are still cut. Quote, last week, some officials were given lists of contracts and awards that remained active. But by the weekend, many of those projects had been axed. Then on Tuesday, yesterday, some of the programs were restored with little explanation. But now, still, the administration has, quote, slashed many of the programs it had pledged to preserve. They cannot explain what they're doing. They cannot defend what they're doing. They cannot commit to what they're doing. But they also can't even reverse what they're doing when they try to reverse it, because they are so incompetent they can't even fail properly. They're like a baby just mashing down the buttons on a keyboard.